Aiden Williams stands in the courtroom, hands trembling as the two officers who arrested him snicker from the witness stand. The judge's gavel slams down, demanding order as the courtroom doors burst open. A tall figure in an impeccable suit walks in with an entourage of agents. The officer's laughter dies instantly when the stranger places a hand on Aiden's shoulder and says, "That's enough. This is my son." Before I dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about justice being served to those who abuse their power. Now, let's rewind to see how this powerful courtroom moment came to be. 16-year-old Aiden Williams was walking home from his advanced placement study group in the affluent neighborhood of Oakage, a place where people like him supposedly didn't look like they belonged. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of multi-million-dollar homes as Aiden adjusted his backpack filled with calculus and physics textbooks. He'd stayed late working on a group project, his mind still processing complex equations when he noticed the police cruiser slowing down beside him. Officers Brennan and Matthews had been patrolling the area when they spotted him, a black teenager in a neighborhood that was 98% white. Officer Brennan, a stocky man with 20 years on the force and a reputation for keeping the peace, nudged his partner. "Look at this one. Definitely doesn't live around here," he muttered as Matthews, younger but eager to impress his senior partner, nodded in agreement. They followed Aiden in their patrol car for 3 blocks, close enough that Aiden could hear the low rumble of the engine behind him. His heart rate quickened. His parents had given him the talk when he turned 12 about how to behave if ever stopped by police. Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully. Move slowly. Don't argue. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed as the siren chirped twice. "Hey you, stop right there," Officer Brennan called through the window. Aiden stopped immediately, turning slowly with his hands clearly visible at his sides. "Good afternoon, officers. Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now pumping through his system. Officer Matthews exited the vehicle, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You match the description of a suspect in the area. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Aiden swallowed hard. "I'm walking home, sir. I live on Maple Avenue with my parents. We moved here 3 months ago. I was at a study group at the library." Officer Brennan had joined his partner now, circling Aiden like a predator. "Sure you do, kid. Got some ID on you?" Aiden nodded. "Yes, sir. In my wallet. I'm going to reach for my back pocket now." "Okay." The officers exchanged amused glances at his careful narration. "Well, aren't you well trained?" Brennan smirked. Aiden slowly retrieved his school ID, which showed his name and photo, but not his address. "This doesn't prove you live here," Matthew said, flicking the ID card dismissively. "I can call my father if you'd like to verify my address," Aiden offered, trying to remain calm. This suggestion seemed to amuse the officers even more. "Oh, your daddy's going to vouch for you. What's he do around here, Mullins?" "Clean pools." Brennan laughed, and Matthews joined in. Aiden felt heat rising in his face, but remembered his father's words. "Your dignity matters more than their ignorance." "My father works for the federal government," he said simply. This only made the officers laugh harder. "Sure he does, kid. Probably cleaning toilets at City Hall," Matthews snorted. Aiden reached slowly for his phone. "I can call him right now." He never finished the sentence. Officer Brennan suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Aiden's arm and twisting it behind his back. "He's reaching for something," he shouted, though the phone was clearly visible in Aiden's hand. Within seconds, Aiden found himself slammed against the patrol car, his face pressed against the hot metal. "I was just getting my phone," he gasped as Brennan roughly handcuffed him. "Yeah, that's what they all say," Matthews replied, taking the phone and pocketing it, resisting arrest and suspicious behavior in a residential area. As they loaded him into the back of the patrol car, Aiden tried once more. "Please, my father works." Matthews cut him off with a laugh. "Let me guess, FBI, CIA. Maybe he's the president." Both officers howled with laughter as they slammed the door through the partition. Aiden could hear them continuing to mock him. "These kids and their stories," Brennan chuckled. Federal government. That's a new one. They took his backpack as evidence, rifling through his AP homework and advanced textbooks. Probably stole these from some rich kid. Matthews commented, ignoring the fact that Aiden's name was written inside each book. As the cruiser pulled away, Aiden caught a glimpse of Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, watching from her porch with a concerned expression. He hoped she would call his parents, but the cruiser turned the corner and the familiar streets of his neighborhood disappeared from view. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Aiden was led through, processing, his wrists still bound by handcuffs that bit into his skin. The station smelled of industrial cleaner, stale coffee, and a lingering scent of desperation that seemed embedded in the very walls. Name, barked the intake officer without looking up from his computer. Aiden Williams, he replied, his voice quiet but clear. The officer snorted, "Speak up, boy. This isn't your classroom." Aiden repeated his name louder, fighting to keep his voice from trembling. After taking his fingerprints and a mug shot, instructing him not to smile as if Aiden had any reason to, they placed his personal belongings in a plastic bin. "I need to call my father," Aiden said for what felt like the 100th time. The intake officer yawned dramatically. "Foes are a privilege, not a right. You'll get your call when we process you fully." Aiden knew his rights. One phone call was standard procedure, but arguing seemed dangerous in this environment where he was already viewed as a problem. Officer Matthews appeared seemingly energized by the situation. "Got one of those honor roll thugs," he announced to the room, guiding Aiden with unnecessary force through the station. Several officers looked up, some with interest, others with indifference born of routine. "Claims his daddy works for the government," Matthews continued, triggering chuckles from his colleagues. "Probably the same government that sends him a welfare check." Someone called out, eliciting more laughter. Each step through the station felt like walking a gauntlet of prejudice. Aiden kept his eyes forward, his face a careful mask, hiding the storm of emotions beneath: fear, anger, humiliation, and beneath it all, a growing sense of resolve. They finally reached a holding cell where Officer Matthews removed the handcuffs with a rough twist. "Welcome to your new presidential suite," he said, shoving Aiden inside and slamming the door with a metallic clang that echoed through the room. The cell contained a metal bench, a toilet with no privacy screen, and one other occupant, an older black man with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. He looked up as Aiden entered, assessing him with a glance. "First time?" he asked after the officer left. Aiden nodded, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had left angry red marks. "Jerome," the man said, simply offering no last name. "Aiden," he replied cautiously, taking a seat on the bench, leaving appropriate distance between them. "What they get you for?" Jerome asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Existing in the wrong neighborhood," Aiden said with a bitter edge he couldn't quite suppress. Jerome nodded sagely. "Ah, the classic walking while black charge. Very serious offense in these parts." His sarcasm held no humor, only the weight of experienced truth. For the next hour, Jerome quietly educated Aiden on survival tactics for dealing with the system: when to speak, when to stay silent, what rights they could ignore and which ones they couldn't. "Your first lesson," Jerome said, leaning forward slightly, "is that the law on paper and the law in practice are different animals entirely. Your second lesson is that patience is your strongest weapon right now." Meanwhile, across town, FBI Director David Williams was in the middle of a high-level operation briefing. Seated at the head of a conference table in a secure room deep within the FBI headquarters, he listened intently as his team discussed the final stages of a 2-year investigation into a sophisticated money laundering operation. David was known for his laser focus and unflappable demeanor, qualities that had propelled him to the highest position in the Bureau despite the systemic barriers that had attempted to hold him back throughout his career. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his posture perfect even after 12 hours on duty. "The simultaneous raids need to be coordinated down to the second," he was saying when a knock interrupted the meeting. His new assistant, Agent Reina Torres, entered with an apologetic expression that immediately caught David's attention. In their line of work, unscheduled interruptions usually meant significant developments. "Excuse me, Director Williams," she said, her voice professional but urgent. "There's a message regarding your son that requires immediate attention." Something in her eyes told him this wasn't a routine matter. David maintained his composed exterior, while his mind immediately shifted to his family. With a slight nod, he addressed the room. "Continue mapping out the coordination sequence. I'll be back shortly." In the hallway, Agent Torres handed him a note with the details. Aiden had been arrested in their neighborhood on suspicious behavior charges. No phone call had been allowed. They'd only learned of it because a neighbor had witnessed the arrest and contacted Catherine, his wife, who was currently in court herself, on a case. David's expression revealed nothing as he processed this information. But those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the only outward sign of the controlled fury building within him. "Thank you, Agent Torres. Please inform Deputy Director Clark that I'll need him to take over the briefing. Have my car brought around." As Torres hurried to carry out his instructions, David made several private calls. First to his wife, then to his personal security detail, and finally to the office of the Attorney General. Each conversation was brief, measured, and purposeful. David Williams hadn't become the first black FBI director by reacting impulsively to injustice. He had learned to channel his responses through the system he had spent decades navigating and reforming from within. Now, that system would work for his son. As he ended the last call, David's thoughts turned to Aiden, a brilliant, gentle boy with his mother's sharp mind and his own quiet dignity. A boy who should never have had to use the careful instructions his parents had given him about surviving police encounters. A boy who was now experiencing firsthand the reality his parents had worked so hard to shield him from, even as they prepared him for its inevitable intrusion into his life. David straightened his tie, checked his watch, and headed toward the elevator. His face betrayed nothing of his internal thoughts, but his purpose was clear and unwavering. The officers who had arrested his son had no idea what was coming their way. What would you do if someone targeted your child because of their skin color? Would you explode in rage or calculate your every move? Comment number 1. If you believe Director Williams should immediately reveal his identity to teach these officers a lesson, or number 2, if you think his strategic patience will deliver greater justice. Like and subscribe to see how this father's controlled fury changes everything. Now imagine walking into a place designed to intimidate you, knowing your child is being held there unjustly. How would you maintain your composure? David Williams arrived at the police station in an unmarked government vehicle, instructing his driver to wait. He wore no flashy indicators of his position, just his standard dark suit, white shirt, and subtle tie, a deliberately understated appearance that allowed him to observe without immediately revealing his authority. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the station parking lot as he straightened his jacket and entered through the main doors. The reception area bustled with activity, officers filing reports, civilians waiting impatiently on hard plastic chairs, phones ringing unanswered. David approached the front desk, where a heavy-set desk sergeant was typing laboriously with 2 fingers, deliberately ignoring the growing line before him. "Excuse me," David said politely but firmly. The sergeant continued typing for a full 30 seconds before looking up with unconcealed annoyance. "Take a seat. I'll get to you when I get to you." David remained standing. "I'm here regarding Aiden Williams, brought in approximately 2 hours ago. I'm his father." The sergeant's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed David. "Wills? Huh. Let me check if we've got him." He made a show of slowly scrolling through his computer, taking occasional sips from a coffee mug emblazoned with the slogan, "I'm not always right, but I'm never wrong." The sergeant finally looked up. "Yeah, we got him. Resisting arrest and suspicious activity. You can wait over there with everyone else." He gestured to the crowded seating area where several people had already been waiting for hours, judging by their defeated postures. "I'd like to see my son now," David stated, his tone remaining respectful, but with a subtle shift that most people trained in authority would recognize as non-negotiable. The sergeant's face flushed slightly. "Listen, mister, we got procedures. Your boy isn't processed yet. Could be another hour. Could be tomorrow morning. Depends how busy we get. He pointedly turned his attention to the person behind David. Next, David didn't move. My son is 16 years old. He's entitled to have a parent present during questioning. Has he been allowed his phone call? The sergeant stood his considerable bulk meant to intimidate. You're holding up the line. Either take a seat or leave the building. Your choice. Several nearby officers had taken notice of the exchange, some watching with interest, others with the weary recognition that something unusual was happening. David calmly reached for his wallet, and the sergeant's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon. The motion wasn't lost on David, who slowly produced a business card rather than ID and placed it on the counter. I believe Captain Reeves would want to be informed that I'm here. The sergeant glanced at the card dismissively, then did a double take, his expression shifting as he read it more carefully. Wait here, he muttered, all previous bravado evaporating as he picked up a phone and turned away to speak in hushed tones. Within minutes, the atmosphere in the station underwent a subtle transformation. Officers who had been lounging suddenly found paperwork to attend to. The sergeant disappeared through a door, replaced by a younger officer who repeatedly glanced at David with poorly concealed curiosity. Finally, the door opened again to reveal a woman in her 50s with captain's bars on her uniform and an expression of growing alarm. Director Williams, Captain Sandra Reeves, said loud enough that heads turned throughout the room. I had no idea you were here. Please come with me. She gestured toward a private hallway, her entire demeanor a stark contrast to the reception David had initially received. As they walked, Captain Reeves spoke in an urgent, hushed tone. Sir, I worked with your task force on the Henderson trafficking case 5 years ago. If I had known your son was brought in, I would have immediately. David interrupted her smoothly. Let's discuss this in private, Captain. She nodded quickly, leading him to her office and closing the door. Where's my son, David? Asked, declining her offer to sit. He's in holding cell 3. I'll have him brought to an interview room immediately, she replied, reaching for her phone. That won't be necessary yet, David said. First, I'd like to speak with the arresting officers. Captain Reeves hesitated visibly. Officers Brennan and Matthews are completing their shift. I can call them in tomorrow. Now, Captain David said quietly. The simple phrase carried such natural authority that she immediately picked up her phone again. Have Officers Brennan and Matthews report to my office immediately. While they waited, David declined coffee, but requested the arrest report and any body camera footage. Captain Reeves scrambled to comply clearly, trying to process how the situation had escalated to having the FBI director in her station. 10 minutes later, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Officers Brennan and Matthews. They entered with the confident swagger of men accustomed to their authority, going unquestioned, though they cast curious glances at David. You wanted to see us, Captain Officer Brennan asked, barely concealing his annoyance at being summoned at the end of his shift. Yes, Captain Reeves replied, her voice tight. This gentleman has some questions about an arrest you made today in Oakage. A 16-year-old named Aiden Williams. The officers exchanged a quick glance before Officer Matthews spoke. The suspect was behaving suspiciously in a residential area where there have been recent break-ins. When questioned, he became confrontational and reached for what could have been a weapon. Officer Brennan nodded in agreement. We followed proper protocol for the situation. David, who had been standing by the window observing them, finally spoke. And did this suspect tell you he lived in the neighborhood? Officer Brennan scoffed slightly. They all say that, sir. We had reasonable suspicion based on what exactly? David interrupted, his voice, still calm, but with an edge that made both officers straighten slightly. Did the suspect description you were responding to specify a black male? The officers shifted uncomfortably before Matthews answered. We were responding to suspicious behavior, not a specific description. David nodded thoughtfully. I see. And when my son told you his father worked for the federal government, you responded by. There was a moment of confused silence before the realization hit. Captain Reeves, who had already made the connection, watched as the blood drained from both officers' faces. Your son, Officer Brennan stammered. Your Captain Reeves cleared her throat. Gentlemen, This is Director David Williams of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt in the small office. Matthews took an involuntary step backward while Brennan's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so dramatically that even the air seemed to change. "Now," David said, his voice deceptively conversational. "Let's discuss what really happened today, shall we?" The tension in Captain Reeves' office could have been cut with a knife as Officers Brennan and Matthews struggled to process the revelation of David Williams' identity. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of understanding exactly whose son they had arrested, mocked, and denied basic rights. "I'd like to see the body camera footage," David stated, his voice level and professional despite the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Captain Reeves nodded quickly. "Of course, Director Williams, we can review that right away." She turned to her computer, fingers dancing nervously across the keyboard. Officer Matthews cleared his throat. "Sir, there may have been a technical malfunction with the cameras during certain portions of the interaction." David raised an eyebrow slightly. "How convenient." Both cameras malfunctioned simultaneously. Officer Brennan stepped forward, attempting to regain some control of the situation. "Sir, regardless of any technical issues, your son was in a neighborhood where he didn't appear to belong, and his behavior raised legitimate concerns." "My son was walking home from a study group in our neighborhood," David interrupted calmly. "We've lived on Maple Avenue for 3 months. He was carrying a backpack full of AP textbooks, not burglary tools." "What specific behavior raised your concerns, Officer Brennan?" The officer's face flushed red. "He matched a profile of Show Me the Dispatch record with this profile," David requested, cutting him off again. "I'd like to see the exact description you were responding to." Captain Reeves, who had been searching through the system, looked up with visible discomfort. "I have the dispatch records here, Director." She turned her monitor so David could see. The description that had been radioed to Officers Brennan and Matthews was for a suspicious person reported near Oakage, white male 30s, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a red hoodie. David nodded, taking a seat across from him as Captain Reeves discreetly left them alone. "Tell me everything," he said. "Don't leave anything out." For the next 20 minutes, Aiden recounted the entire experience, from being followed by the patrol car to the racial comments the officers had made, the rough handling during the arrest, and the mockery he'd endured at the station. Throughout the account, David listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly allowing his son to speak uninterrupted. When Aiden finished, David placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did everything right," he assured him. "You stayed calm. You were respectful. You followed the instructions we've talked about. What happened wasn't your fault." Aiden nodded, then asked the question that had been weighing on him. "What happens now?" David considered his response carefully. "Now we handle this properly. There are 2 paths forward. The easy path would be to use my position to make this go away quietly. The officers would face some discipline. You'd be released immediately, and we'd move on." He paused, studying his son's face. "The harder path means bringing everything to light. The profiling, the rights violations, the falsified reports. It would be more difficult for all of us, but it might help ensure this doesn't happen so easily to someone else." He leaned forward slightly. "This has to be your choice, too, Aiden. Either way, I'll support you." Aiden was quiet for a moment, processing the options. "What about the other guy in the holding cell, Jerome? He's been there since yesterday for suspicious loitering. No one's coming for him." David nodded, understanding his son's concern. "If we take the harder path, we can help him, too. We can help bring attention to the pattern, not just the single incident." Aiden met his father's eyes with newfound resolve. "Then I think we have to take the harder path." David squeezed his son's shoulder pride momentarily, overtaking his anger at the situation. "Then that's what we'll do." Meanwhile, word of Director Williams' presence had spread like wildfire through the station. Officer Brennan had immediately called his uncle, Judge Richard Brennan, who had connections throughout the local power structure, including Police Commissioner Harrison. The judge had been playing golf with the commissioner when the call came through, and both men immediately recognized the potential disaster unfolding. Within an hour, An informal crisis meeting convened in the commissioner's office, where Judge Brennan, Commissioner Harrison, and the department's legal counsel discussed damage control strategies. "This needs to go away immediately," Commissioner Harrison insisted, pacing the room. "Offer whatever it takes. Full dismissal of charges. Disciplinary action for the officers. A formal apology." Judge Brennan nodded in agreement. "Add a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. The last thing we need is the FBI director making a public issue out of this." The department's attorney looked skeptical. Director Williams has a reputation for integrity. He may not be interested in a quiet settlement. Commissioner Harrison stopped pacing to face the others. Everyone has a price or a pressure point. If he won't respond to an offer, remind him that turning this into a public spectacle could politicize his position. The FBI director needs to appear impartial, not like he's on a personal crusade. As they strategized damage control, none of them realized that David Williams had already anticipated their playbook and had begun implementing countermeasures that would make their usual methods of containing such incidents ineffective. The local power structure was about to discover that they had picked the wrong family to target with their unwritten policies of intimidation and control. Have you ever wondered what happens when powerful people realize they've made a terrible mistake? Would you use your power to seek quiet revenge or systematic change? Comment number 1, if you think David should focus solely on his son's case, or number 2, if he should expose the entire corrupt system. Like this video and subscribe to our channel to see how this father transforms personal injustice into meaningful change. What would you risk to protect not just your family, but your entire community? The Williams family home sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees in the Oakage neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like any other upscale residence. A tasteful colonial with manicured gardens and a 2-car garage. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. In the days following Aiden's arrest, Catherine Williams, a formidable civil rights attorney in her own right, had kindled her court appearances to focus on their son and the situation at hand. The kitchen island had become an impromptu command center covered with legal documents, reports, and Catherine's laptop. Aiden sat at the breakfast table, headphones on, trying to focus on schoolwork he'd missed, but finding his attention repeatedly drifting back to memories of the holding cell. The sound of the front door opening announced David's return from the office. He entered the kitchen still in his work suit, carrying a thick manila folder. Catherine looked up expectantly. "How did the meeting with Deputy Director Clark go?" David set the folder on the counter and loosened his tie. "He's fully supportive. The Bureau will back whatever approach we decide to take." He glanced at Aiden, who had removed his headphones to join the conversation. "How are you feeling today?" Aiden shrugged slightly. "Better. Still not sleeping great." The nightmares had started the night after his release. Vivid dreams of being trapped, of faceless officers laughing as he tried to explain who he was. David and Catherine exchanged concerned glances before David opened the folder he brought home. "I had our analysts do some digging into Officers Brennan and Matthews. This isn't their first rodeo." He spread several documents across the island counter. 12 complaints of excessive force in the past 3 years. 9 involved minorities. All were dismissed during internal reviews. Catherine examined the reports with a lawyer's practiced eye. All dismissed by the same review board member, Captain James Wilson. David nodded, who happens to be Commissioner Harrison's brother-in-law. He pulled out another document, but that's just the beginning. "I had the team run an analysis of arrest statistics for the precinct covering Oakage and surrounding neighborhoods. The pattern is unmistakable. The data showed that Black residents and visitors in predominantly white neighborhoods were 6 times more likely to be stopped, 8 times more likely to be searched, and 10 times more likely to be arrested than white individuals in the same areas, even when controlling for actual crime rates." Catherine's expression hardened as she reviewed the statistics. "This isn't random. This is systematic." David pulled out another file. "It gets worse. There's an unofficial initiative called Neighborhood Integrity that never appears in any official police documents, but shows up repeatedly in email exchanges between certain officers, including Brennan and Matthews. He showed them printed emails where officers discussed maintaining neighborhood standards and keeping undesirable elements from lowering property values. thinly veiled code for racial profiling. The whole system is designed to intimidate people of color from moving into or even visiting these affluent areas, David explained. And when someone like the commissioner or Judge Brennan wants to keep things quiet, cases disappear, complaints get buried, and officers receive commendations rather than discipline. While his parents discussed the evidence, Aiden sat quietly processing the implications. It wasn't just him. It wasn't a random encounter or bad luck. It was a deliberate system designed to make people like him feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Later that evening, after Aiden had gone upstairs, David and Catherine continued their discussion in hushed tones in the living room. "I've been in touch with the Civil Rights Division at Justice," David said. "The pattern here could justify a federal investigation into discriminatory policing practices." Catherine nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "We need to be careful about how we proceed. Using your position as FBI director to address what happened to Aiden could be seen as a conflict of interest." David leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "I've thought about that. I've already recused myself officially from any direct involvement in the investigation. Deputy Director Clark will oversee any bureau actions." Catherine reached for his hand. "That addresses the technical conflict, but you know how this will be perceived. Some will say you're using federal resources for a personal vendetta." "Let them," David replied, a rare edge entering his voice. This was never just about Aiden. He just happened to be the one who exposed what's been happening to countless others without his advantages. They were interrupted by the sound of breaking glass upstairs, followed by a muffled cry. Both parents rushed to Aiden's room to find him standing by his desk, breathing heavily, a shattered water glass at his feet. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, his voice unsteady. "I was just thinking about going back to school tomorrow, and my hand he trailed off, looking at the scattered glass with confusion, as if uncertain how it had happened. Catherine quickly helped clean up the glass, while David observed their son with growing concern. The confident, academically gifted teenager who loved debate club and basketball now jumped at sudden noises and had trouble focusing on conversations. The incident had left invisible wounds that might take longer to heal than they had initially hoped. The next morning, David made several calls from his home office before heading to the bureau. The first was to a trusted FBI analyst named Sarah Chun, requesting deeper background checks on key figures in the local police department and judicial system. The second was to Jerome Washington, the man who had shared the holding cell with Aiden. David had quietly arranged for a public defender to review Jerome's case, resulting in all charges being dropped due to insufficient evidence. The third call was to his security detail, increasing protection for Catherine and Aiden in case of retaliation as they moved forward. By mid-afternoon, Sarah Chun had delivered preliminary findings that connected several dots. Judge Brennan, Commissioner Harrison, and 5 wealthy community figures who funded police foundation events all belonged to an exclusive country club where, despite anti-discrimination laws, no black members had ever been admitted. These same individuals had opposed integrated housing initiatives in the area for years, using zoning laws and property covenants as legal covers for maintaining the neighborhood's demographics. Additionally, Officer Brennan's performance reviews showed commendations specifically for his work in maintaining community standards in high-value residential areas, language that mirrored the unofficial Neighborhood Integrity Initiative. The picture coming together was one of coordinated, systematic exclusion masked behind bureaucratic language and procedural smokescreens. Meanwhile, Aiden's return to school had been challenging. Though some teachers and friends were supportive, rumors about his arrest had spread distorted through the teenage gossip mill. In his AP physics class, he noticed several students whispering and glancing his way. His basketball teammate Marcus approached him at lunch. "Dude, what really happened? Some people are saying you went crazy on some cops." Aiden struggled to find the right words to explain the experience without sounding like he was playing the victim or seeking sympathy. By the end of the day, he felt emotionally drained from navigating the subtle and not so subtle reactions to his absence. That evening, when Catherine suggested filing a public lawsuit against the police department, tensions emerged in the Williams household. A lawsuit puts everything on record, Catherine argued. It creates a public account that can't be buried in internal reviews. David, while not disagreeing with her assessment, advocated for a more strategic approach. A lawsuit is reactive. I'm thinking about something more comprehensive, a federal pattern or practice investigation that looks at the entire system, not just what happened to Aiden. Their different professional backgrounds led to different perspectives on how to fight the same battle. Catherine, who had spent her career directly confronting injustice in courtrooms, favored immediate visible action. David, who had navigated the labyrinthine federal bureaucracy to create change from within, preferred methodical pressure applied at strategic points. Aiden, listening to his parents debate approaches from the stairway landing, felt caught between their strategies, just as he felt caught between the world that had existed before his arrest and the new reality he now inhabited. The incident had stripped away a layer of innocence, revealing the true nature of systems he had previously understood only in the abstract through his parents' experiences and warnings. Now those warnings had become his lived reality, and the path forward seemed uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the Williams family would not be silent, and the power structure that had operated in the shadows for so long was about to face a reckoning they never anticipated. Have you ever watched someone powerful try to buy their way out of accountability? Would you take a generous settlement to keep quiet about injustice? Or would you risk everything for the truth? Comment number 1, if you would take the money and move on, or number 2, if you would fight for justice no matter the cost. Like this video and subscribe to see what Director Williams chooses when faced with this impossible decision. What would you do if someone tried to use your career as leverage against your family's fight for justice? 3 days after Aiden's arrest, Commissioner Harrison's office reached out to schedule a private resolution meeting with David Williams. The carefully worded invitation suggested a desire to amicably address recent unfortunate events without unnecessary escalation. David recognized the strategy immediately, the standard playbook for making potentially embarrassing incidents disappear quietly. After consulting with Catherine and Aiden, he agreed to the meeting, though with very different intentions than the commissioner likely anticipated. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon in Judge Brennan's private chambers. Neutral ground that wasn't so neutral given the judge's connections to Officer Brennan. David arrived precisely on time, declining the offered coffee, as he took a seat across from Commissioner Harrison, Judge Brennan, and a nervous-looking city attorney. The wood-paneled room, with its leather-bound law books and oil paintings of former judges, created an atmosphere of established authority that David knew was meant to intimidate visitors. Commissioner Harrison, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and a politician's smile, opened the conversation with practiced sincerity. Director Williams, first, let me express my personal regret about what happened to your son. That's not how we expect our officers to conduct themselves. David nodded slightly, but offered no response, a negotiation tactic that often unsettled those expecting immediate engagement. The commissioner continued into the awkward silence. We've reviewed the incident thoroughly and are prepared to take immediate action. All charges against Aiden will be dropped completely with no record of the arrest maintained. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his judicial authority evident in his bearing. Additionally, both officers involved will face disciplinary action, 2-week suspension without pay, and mandatory sensitivity training. The city attorney slid a document across the table. We're also prepared to offer a generous settlement of $100,000 for any distress caused in exchange for a standard confidentiality agreement. David glanced at the document without touching it. And what exactly would this confidentiality agreement cover? The attorney cleared his throat. Just the standard language, an agreement not to discuss the incident publicly, not to pursue further legal action, and mutual acknowledgement that the settlement doesn't constitute admission of wrongdoing. I see, David, said his voice, revealing nothing of his thoughts. And you believe this adequately addresses what happened to my son? Commissioner Harrison spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. We believe it's a fair and generous resolution that allows everyone to move forward positively. These unfortunate incidents can spiral into divisive public controversies that serve no one's interests. David finally picked up the agreement, appearing to study it thoughtfully. And if I find these terms insufficient, the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly as Judge Brennan leaned back in his chair. Director Williams, we all have professional responsibilities to consider. Your position at the FBI requires public trust and political neutrality. Pursuing a personal grievance through official channels could create the appearance of impropriety. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Back off or face professional consequences. David set the document down and met each man's gaze in turn before speaking. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time today. Before I respond to your offer, I should inform you of several developments. He maintained his calm, measured tone as he continued. First, I formally recused myself from any FBI investigation related to this matter the day after my son's arrest. That recusal was filed with the Attorney General's office and the FBI Ethics Division. The commissioner and judge exchanged quick glances as David continued. Second, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a preliminary investigation yesterday into patterns of discriminatory policing in this district based on statistical evidence that predates my son's experience. He paused to let this information sink in. Third, all evidence related to Aiden's arrest, including body camera footage, dispatch records, and the officer's history of complaints, has been preserved through federal evidence protocols. Any alteration of those records now would constitute obstruction of justice. The city attorney visibly palled as David delivered the final point. Lastly, I've already provided a detailed statement to journalist Maya Rodriguez, who's preparing an investigative piece on the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative. The story has been held temporarily at my request while the Justice Department completes its initial assessment. Complete silence fell over the room as the three men processed what they just heard. David had systematically neutralized their leverage, anticipated their tactics, and positioned the incident within a larger framework that couldn't be easily dismissed or buried. Commissioner Harrison was the first to recover. This is highly irregular, Director Williams, using federal resources for what is essentially a personal matter. The pattern of civil rights violations in this district is not a personal matter. David interrupted calmly. My son was simply one victim among many. The fact that this particular victim happened to be the son of the FBI director doesn't make the underlying problem any less real or any less deserving of investigation. I'll be declining your settlement offer. Good afternoon, gentlemen. As David left the building, his phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Maya called. Someone from the department reached out to her with information. The carefully constructed cover-up was beginning to crumble from within. Officer Jason Matthews sat in his car outside the offices of the City Tribune, questioning his decision for the 20th time. 15 years on, the force had taught him the unwritten rule. You protect the department no matter what. But the events of the past week had shaken something loose inside him. Maybe it was the look on the teenager's face when they'd mocked his claims about his father. Maybe it was the realization that he'd been manipulated into becoming the kind of cop he'd once despised. Or maybe it was simply self-preservation, recognizing that he was being set up to take the fall while the higher-ups escaped consequences. Whatever the reason, he made contact with journalist Maya Rodriguez, known for her unflinching coverage of police misconduct. Their meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Matthews provided details that shocked even the veteran reporter. How certain officers were specifically assigned to patrol affluent neighborhoods with instructions to discourage undesirable elements. How complaint records were routinely altered before review boards saw them. And how officers who questioned these practices found themselves assigned to the worst shifts and most dangerous areas. Most damning were the emails and text messages he'd preserved, showing directives from superior officers that never appeared in official communications, but clearly established the discriminatory intent behind the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative. Why are you doing this? Maya had asked toward the end of their conversation. Matthews had stared at his coffee for a long moment before answering. Because I joined to protect people, not to terrorize them, and because when this all comes out, and I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. The following day, Aiden returned to school, still dealing with the emotional aftermath of his arrest. The halls seemed different now. Every glance potentially judgmental. Every conversation possibly about him. His AP history teacher, Mrs. Garcia, pulled him aside after class. "Aiden, I want you to know that what happened wasn't right. If you need someone to talk to, or if you need extra time on assignments, just let me know." Her kindness nearly broke through the careful, emotional wall he'd constructed, but he managed a nod and a quiet thank you before continuing to his next class. At lunch, he sat with his usual friends, but the conversation felt forced with awkward pauses whenever anything related to police or authority came up. Only his closest friend, Tyler, seemed willing to address the elephant in the room. "Dude, that was messed up what they did to you. My dad says those cops are going to regret it big time when your dad gets through with them." Aiden picked at his food. "It's not that simple. It's not just about those two officers." He tried to explain the larger pattern his parents had uncovered, but found it difficult to articulate the complex systemic issues in a way his 16-year-old peers could relate to. Some nodded supportively, while others seemed uncomfortable with the implications. By the end of the school day, Aiden felt emotionally drained from navigating the social minefield. As he walked toward the exit, he noticed a small group of students gathered around a phone watching something. He caught a glimpse of the screen and froze. It was body camera footage of his arrest, somehow leaked online. His private humiliation had become public spectacle. That evening, as the Williams family discussed next steps in their dining room, the local news broke the story. FBI director's son allegedly profiled in controversial arrest. Officer comes forward with evidence of systematic discrimination. The carefully managed narrative the department had tried to construct was unraveling faster than they could control it. Commissioner Harrison called an emergency press conference, announcing a full internal review and promising complete transparency, the standard crisis management response. But this time, the usual playbook wouldn't work. Too many pieces were in motion. Too many people were watching, and too many brave individuals had decided that maintaining the status quo wasn't worth the cost to their conscience or their community. The cover-up that had succeeded so many times before was failing spectacularly, exposing not just a single incident of injustice, but an entire system designed to perpetuate inequality under the guise of law and order. Despite Commissioner Harrison's frantic efforts to have all charges dismissed, Aiden's arraignment proceeded as scheduled in courtroom 3B of the county courthouse. The Williams family had insisted on it, recognizing the strategic value of a public legal proceeding that would enter all evidence into the official record. Catherine had successfully filed for Judge Brennan's recusal due to his relationship with Officer Brennan, resulting in Judge Mary Ann Shunn presiding instead. The courtroom buzzed with unusual energy that morning. Local media filled the gallery, joined by representatives from national outlets drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. Officers Brennan and Matthews sat at the prosecution table, surrounded by department attorneys who had spent days coaching them on their testimony. Their confident expressions suggested they believed the situation remained manageable, a temporary public relations challenge rather than a career-ending scandal. Aiden sat at the defense table beside Catherine, who had insisted on representing him herself, despite offers from prominent criminal defense attorneys eager to take the high-profile case. David sat directly behind them in the first row of the gallery, his presence commanding attention without a single word being spoken. He had arrived separately, declining to answer reporters' questions as he entered the building. Judge Shunn called the court to order her non-nonsense demeanor, immediately establishing control over the proceedings. This court will address case number 2024 CR 187-2 count versus Aiden Williams on charges of resisting arrest and suspicious behavior. How does the defendant plead? Catherine Rose. Not guilty, Your Honor. Additionally, we move to dismiss all charges due to lack of probable cause and violation of my client's constitutional rights. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Reynolds, immediately objected. Your Honor, the state has substantial evidence supporting these charges. The officers had reasonable suspicion based on the defendant's behavior in an area with recent criminal activity. Judge Shunn regarded both attorneys thoughtfully. I'll hear testimony before ruling on the motion to dismiss. Call your first witness, Mr. Reynolds. Officer Brennan took the stand first, sworn in with a steady voice despite the beads of sweat visible at his hairline. Under direct examination, he presented the narrative they had carefully constructed, how Aiden had been skulking through an affluent neighborhood, had responded aggressively to routine questioning, and had made a sudden movement that justified the forceful arrest. And did the defendant identify himself as a resident of the neighborhood? Reynolds asked. He made that claim, yes. Officer Brennan replied, but without identification proving his address and given his suspicious behavior, we had reason to doubt his statement. Catherine approached for cross-examination with a controlled precision that had made her reputation in civil rights cases. Officer Brennan, you testified that you stopped my client because he matched a suspect description. What exactly was that description? Brennan shifted slightly. Male suspicious behavior in an area with recent break-ins. Catherine maintained eye contact. That's interesting because the dispatch records entered as Defense Exhibit A show. The only suspect description that day was for a white male in his 30s wearing a red hoodie. My client is a black teenager who was wearing a blue academic decathlon jacket. Can you explain the discrepancy? Brennan's confidence faltered visibly. The suspicious behavior was the primary factor, not the physical description. Catherine moved on methodically. You also testified that my client responded aggressively. Your body camera was functioning at that point, correct? Yes, but let's review that footage Catherine suggested signaling for the court technician. The video showed Aiden responding politely to initial questioning, his hands visible at all times, directly contradicting Officer Brennan's testimony. As the cross-examination continued, Catherine systematically dismantled Brennan's account, highlighting contradictions between his testimony, the written report, and the available evidence. When Officer Matthews took the stand next, his testimony seemed rehearsed and defensive. He maintained that the arrest had been justified based on training and experience, insisting there had been no racial component to their actions. Catherine's cross-examination took an unexpected turn when she asked Officer Matthews, "Is it standard procedure to mock a detained minor by suggesting his father cleans toilets at City Hall?" A murmur ran through the courtroom as Matthews visibly tensed. "I don't recall making such comments." Catherine approached the bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to play enhanced audio Exhibit C recovered from Officer Matthews' dashcam." The department's attorney immediately objected. This alleged audio wasn't included in discovery materials. Catherine responded calmly. Because it was only recovered yesterday through enhanced audio processing. The defense received the raw dashcam footage in discovery, but the audio required specialized enhancement to overcome the convenient malfunction in the officer's body cameras. Judge Chun considered briefly before ruling. "I'll allow it. The jury should hear all available evidence." The enhanced audio played clearly through the courtroom speakers, capturing the officers' mocking comments about Aiden's father cleaning toilets and their laughter at his claims about working for the federal government. As the recording played, David Williams' expression remained impassive, but his eyes never left Officer Matthews' face. The officer's complexion had gone ashen. Following this damaging evidence, Catherine called Dr. Eleanor Patel, a statistical analyst who presented data showing the pattern of discriminatory arrests in the district. Her testimony revealed that black individuals in predominantly white neighborhoods were stopped at rates wildly disproportionate to white residents, even when controlling for crime rates and time of day. The statistical probability of these disparities occurring randomly is less than 0.001%. Dr. Patel explained this indicates a systematic pattern rather than individual officer discretion. As Catherine prepared to call her next witness, David received a text message and quietly excused himself from the courtroom. Reynolds, sensing the case slipping away, attempted to discredit Dr. Patel's methodology during cross-examination, but only succeeded in allowing her to further explain the robustness of her analysis. Catherine then announced, "The defense calls Deputy Director Thomas Clark of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A stir went through the courtroom as Clark entered with 2 additional agents. He was sworn in and identified himself as the current acting director of the FBI's Civil Rights Investigation Division. Deputy Director Clark, are you currently involved in an investigation related to this case? Catherine asked. Not this specific case, Clark clarified. However, I am leading a federal task force investigating patterns of civil rights violations within this police department, focusing on the Unofficial Neighborhood Integrity Initiative and its disparate impact on minority citizens. He explained that the investigation had been initiated based on statistical evidence and whistleblower testimony that predated Aiden's arrest. And what has your investigation uncovered thus far? Catherine asked. The department attorneys practically leapt from their seats to object. Relevance. This is clearly prejudicial and beyond the scope of this case. Judge Chun considered briefly. I'll allow limited testimony to establish context for the arrest pattern. The witness will not disclose specific details of an ongoing federal investigation. Clark nodded understanding before continuing. Our preliminary findings indicate a coordinated effort to discourage minority presence in certain neighborhoods through selective enforcement, excessive stops, and disparate charging decisions. This pattern appears to involve not just patrol officers, but supervisory personnel and potentially members of the judicial system. The gallery erupted in murmurs as reporters frantically took notes. Officers Brennan and Matthews exchanged alarmed glances, suddenly understanding that David Williams' careful restraint hadn't been weakness. It had been strategic patience while a much larger mechanism of justice was being set in motion. As the day's testimony concluded, Judge Shin announced she would rule on the motion to dismiss the following morning. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Catherine and Aiden as they exited. Mrs. Williams, do you believe your son's case has exposed systematic racism in the police department? One shouted. Catherine responded with measured precision. What happened to my son is unfortunately not unique. The only unique aspect is that he had parents with the resources and knowledge to fight back. Too many others haven't been so fortunate. This case isn't about special treatment for my son. It's about equal treatment for everyone else's children. As cameras flashed and microphones pressed closer, Aiden stood tall beside his mother, no longer the frightened teenager in the holding cell, but a young man finding his voice in the midst of a pivotal moment of reckoning. In the weeks following the courtroom, revelations' ripples of change spread throughout the community. Judge Chun had dismissed all charges against Aiden with a strongly worded rebuke of the officer's conduct, but that was merely the beginning of a larger transformation. Local news stations that had initially reported Aiden's arrest as a routine police matter now ran special investigations into discriminatory policing. Community forums that had once drawn only a handful of dedicated activists now overflowed with concerned citizens from all backgrounds. The Williams family found themselves at the center of a movement they hadn't sought, but now embraced with purpose. Aiden, initially hesitant to step into the spotlight, discovered an unexpected calling. With support from his parents, he started a student advocacy group called Youth for Equal Justice. What began as a small gathering in the Williams' living room quickly grew to include students from schools across the district. This isn't about me anymore, Aiden told the group during their third meeting, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. This is about making sure what happened to me doesn't keep happening to others who don't have the same advantages I do. The group organized educational workshops about civil rights, created, your rights pamphlets specifically for teenagers, and began documenting incidents of discriminatory treatment in schools and by police. Jerome Washington, the man who had shared the holding cell with Aiden, became a mentor to the group, offering perspective from his years of navigating a system designed to disadvantage him. You kids have the energy and the moral clarity, he told them during one session. What you need from folks like me is the context and the history. Meanwhile, David faced increasing political pressure from those with connections to the police department. Senator James Harrington, whose campaign had received substantial donations from the police union, called for oversight hearings into what he termed the FBI director's personal vendetta against local law enforcement. The Bureau's resources should be directed toward national security threats, not settling family disputes, the senator told reporters. Behind closed doors, allies of Commissioner Harrison reached out to contacts in Washington, suggesting that David's leadership had become too political and compromised by personal interests. Catherine's law firm had taken on additional cases identified through the investigation, building toward a class action lawsuit that would seek not just monetary damages, but structural changes in department policies. Her office received so many calls from people with similar experiences that they had to create a special intake system just to manage the volume. One afternoon, as she reviewed potential cases with her partners, Catherine looked up to find her assistant standing nervously in the doorway. "There's someone here to see you," he said. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." The visitor was Officer Jason Matthews alone and without department counsel. Catherine regarded him wearily as he sat across from her desk. "I've agreed to testify," he said without preamble, "about everything, the unofficial directives, the pattern of harassment, how complaints are buried, all of it." Catherine studied him carefully. "Why now?" Matthews looked down at his hands. "I joined a force to help people, not to terrorize kids for walking in their own neighborhoods. The department is trying to make Brennan and me the scapegoats while the people who created the policy walk away clean. I'm not taking the fall alone." His testimony would prove invaluable, providing insider confirmation of what the statistical evidence had already suggested. As details of the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative emerged, the community reaction split along predictable lines. Some residents of Oakage and similar neighborhoods expressed outrage at the discriminatory practices carried out in their name. Others defended the police actions as necessary for community safety and property value protection, their coded language barely disguising the underlying prejudice. Local Facebook groups and community forums became battlegrounds of heated debate. Town hall meetings grew so contentious that mediators had to be brought in to maintain order. Commissioner Harrison and Judge Brennan worked frantically to manage the growing scandal. Their initial strategy of distancing themselves from Officers Brennan and Matthews gave way to a more aggressive approach of questioning the federal investigation's legitimacy. "This is federal overreach and local policing" became their mantra in public statements. Behind the scenes, they worked their political connections, trying to pressure the Department of Justice to rein in the investigation. Their efforts gained limited traction until a wealthy developer named Richard Kavanaugh, who sat on the Police Foundation Board, held a private fundraiser for key congressional representatives. Shortly afterward, David was summoned to a closed-door meeting with the Attorney General, where he was diplomatically reminded about the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal matters and official duties. David emerged from a meeting with his professional composure intact, but Catherine could see the toll the political maneuvering was taking when he returned home that evening. "They're trying to make this about me rather than about what actually happened," he said as they sat on their back porch away from Aiden's ears. "It's the oldest play in the book. Attack the messenger when you can't refute the message." Catherine reached for his hand. "That's why we needed to make this bigger than just Aiden's case. It's harder to dismiss when it's dozens of families coming forward, not just us." David nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I knew there would be pushback, but I underestimated how deep the connections run between the department and certain political figures." For Aiden, the weeks following the courtroom hearing brought both positive and negative developments. His advocacy work had attracted attention from college recruitment officers impressed by his leadership and poise under pressure. Several civil rights organizations had reached out about internship opportunities. At the same time, anonymous threats had begun arriving at the house and through social media, forcing the family to increase security measures. At school, Aiden navigated an increasingly polarized environment. Some teachers and students expressed strong support, while others seemed to blame him for bringing negative attention to the community. During basketball practice, he overheard two teammates complaining that the whole race thing was being blown out of proportion. The coach, noticing Aiden's expression, pulled the team together for an impromptu discussion about empathy and perspective that left several players uncomfortable but thoughtful. Through it all, the Williams family maintained their focus on the larger goal, not justice for Aiden, but systematic change that would prevent similar injustices in the future. The case had evolved from a personal injury to a community reckoning, forcing long overdue conversations about race, power, and accountability. As Officer Matthews had predicted when he first approached journalist Maya Rodriguez, the truth was coming out, and many people were indeed being forced to choose which side of history they wanted to stand on. 6 months after Aiden Williams was wrongfully arrested for walking home in his own neighborhood, a crowd gathered on the steps of the federal courthouse to hear the Department of Justice announcement. The investigation that had begun with one teenager's experience had expanded to encompass decades of discriminatory practices. Deputy Attorney General Samantha Rivera stood at the podium, flanked by federal officials and community representatives. Today, after extensive investigation, the Department of Justice is announcing a consent decree requiring comprehensive reform of the Oak Ridge Police Department, she began. Our investigation found compelling evidence of systematic civil rights violations, discriminatory enforcement patterns, and a failure of accountability at multiple levels. The consent decree mandated sweeping changes, independent oversight, body camera requirements, transparent complaint procedures, revised use of force policies, and regular data collection and analysis to identify potential disparities in enforcement. Most significantly, it dismantled the unofficial Neighborhood Integrity Program, explicitly prohibiting the use of race, ethnicity, or economic status as factors in policing decisions. The fallout from the investigation had already transformed the local power structure. Officer Brennan faced criminal charges for evidence tampering and civil rights violations after investigators discovered he had deliberately altered reports and deleted portions of video evidence. Commissioner Harrison had resigned in disgrace when emails surfaced showing his direct knowledge of and support for the discriminatory practices. Judge Brennan was under judicial review by the state board, his reputation irreparably damaged by revelations of how he had systematically dismissed complaints against officers engaging in profiling. For the Williams family, the journey had been both painful and purposeful. 2 weeks after the consent decree announcement, David was invited to testify before Congress about policing reform. His opening statement acknowledged the personal nature of his involvement. "I appear before you today in multiple capacities as FBI director, as a career law enforcement professional, and as a father whose son experienced firsthand the consequences of discriminatory policing," he began. "These roles are not in conflict. In fact, my personal experience has only deepened my professional commitment to ensuring that constitutional policing is not just an ideal, but a consistent practice." His testimony detailed how seemingly isolated incidents of bias often reflected deeper institutional problems that required structural solutions rather than simply disciplining individual officers. "The officers who arrested my son were not merely bad apples," he explained. "They were responding to incentives, expectations, and unwritten rules established by leadership. Meaningful reform must address the entire orchard, not just remove individual fruits." Meanwhile, Aiden's advocacy group had partnered with Jerome Washington to establish a community oversight board with actual authority to review police practices and individual complaints. Unlike previous oversight efforts that had been largely symbolic, this board included members from diverse backgrounds and had access to department data, body camera footage, and disciplinary records. "The key difference is transparency," Jerome explained during the board's first public meeting. "You can't fix what you can't see, and for too long, these departments have operated in the dark." The consent decree guaranteed the board's access to necessary information for at least the next 5 years with provisions for continuation, based on compliance assessments. On a warm Saturday afternoon, the community gathered for a reconciliation event in the park where Aiden had been arrested. The day featured speakers, workshops, and dialogue circles designed to build understanding across racial and economic divisions. Catherine had helped organize the event, bringing together community leaders, police representatives committed to reform, and families affected by discriminatory practices. Aiden had initially been reluctant to speak, but as he approached the microphone, his nervousness gave way to clarity of purpose. 6 months ago, I was handcuffed and humiliated on this exact spot for the crime of walking while Blackie began. I was scared, angry, and confused. But today, I'm none of those things. He paused, looking out at the diverse crowd. Today, I'm hopeful. Not because what happened to me was unique. It wasn't. What's unique is how our community has responded by acknowledging the problem, demanding accountability, and working toward real change. He spoke about the dozens of other young people who had shared similar experiences through his advocacy group, many of whom lacked the advantages that had helped him fight back. This was never just about me or my family. It was about building a community where justice doesn't depend on who your parents are or what position they hold. As the event concluded, Aiden found himself approached by community members from across the spectrum. Elderly residents who had witnessed decades of uneven policing, young activists energized by the concrete changes being implemented, and even several police officers committed to the department's new direction. Later that evening, as the Williams family returned home, Aiden and his father took a moment alone in the backyard. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass as they sat in comfortable silence before David spoke. I never told you why I joined the FBI in the first place," he said quietly. Aiden looked up with interest. His father rarely discussed his early career motivations. David continued, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "My father, your grandfather, was wrongfully arrested when I was 11 years old. He was driving through an affluent neighborhood to pick up a package for his boss. Someone reported a suspicious vehicle, and the police pulled him over. The parallels to Aiden's experience hung in the air unspoken. But unlike what happened with you, there was no one with power or connections to help him fight back. He spent 8 months in jail before the charges were finally dropped. Lost his job. Nearly lost our house. When he came home, something in him was broken." David paused, remembering, "That's when I decided I would work to change the system from the inside. I thought if I could reach a position of influence, I could help prevent what happened to my father from happening to others." Aiden absorbed this revelation, suddenly understanding his father's career in a new light. "So, when I started Youth for Equal Justice, you were continuing something that began long before you were born," David finished with a nod, "fighting the same battle, just in a different way."